XRP whales control 80% of supply right now, and what they're actually doing might surprise you. Okay, so first thing, let me actually calibrate that number, because depending on exactly which cutoff you use for whale, you get slightly different figures, and I'd rather show you the real sourced version than just repeat a round number because it sounds cleaner. The most current, most reliable figure I can point you to comes from Sentiments, the on-chain analytics firm, and it's specifically about wallets holding 1 million XRP or more. That cohort currently controls roughly 74.1% of circulating supply. And here's the part that actually matters. That number has been growing. These large holders added about 1.53 billion XRP over just the past 6 months. Some trackers that use a slightly looser definition of whale, folding and exchange wallets, and a broader cutoff land closer to that 80% figure in the title. Either way, you're talking about somewhere between 3/4 and 4/5 of the entire supply sitting in a relatively small number of large wallets. And I think it's worth being clear that this 74% figure is a different cut than the narrower top 10 wallets number you might have seen elsewhere, which sits closer to 18 to 20% of circulating supply, mostly Ripple's own escrow structure. The 74% figure is much broader. It's every wallet anywhere on the ledger holding 1 million XRP or more, which captures a huge range of holders, from genuinely massive institutional positions all the way down to what's still, relatively speaking, a meaningful but far smaller individual accumulation. So when people say whales control 80%, they're usually talking about this broader cohort, not the narrow top 10 Ripple escrow. And conflating the two is a really common way these statistics get garbled in less careful coverage. That's the backdrop. Now, let's actually get into what they're doing with it, because that's the part that's genuinely more interesting than the percentage itself. So let's start with the most recent, most current activity, the stuff that's actually happened in the last couple weeks, since that's what right now really means. Whales have been pulling XRP off exchanges into self-custody in a pretty significant way. One on-chain tracking report flagged 720 million XRP withdrawn from exchanges in what it called a coordinated accumulation move, right around the time XRP was trading near $1.21. Withdrawing coins off an exchange and into a private wallet is the opposite of preparing to sell. You generally don't move coins into cold storage. If you're planning to dump them next week, you move them into cold storage because you're planning to sit on them. There's a complementary signal sitting right. Alongside that one too, looking at spot exchange flow data, specifically over a recent 24-hour window, roughly $130 million flowed into exchanges, while about $131.5 million flowed out, leaving a small net outflow. Stretch that out to a longer window and the picture sharpens, something like $685 million entering exchanges against a comparable or larger amount leaving over the same stretch. None of these are dramatic, headline-sized single moves. They're the kind of steady, grinding net outflow that tends to reflect accumulation happening quietly in the background, rather than one big, dramatic, announcement-driven event. At the same time, XRP's spot ETFs have been on a genuine hot streak relative to the rest of the market. Cumulative net inflows into XRP-focused ETF products are sitting around $1.44 billion, with assets under management crossing roughly $1 billion. And here's a comparison that actually makes this interesting. XRP ETFs pulled in net inflows for 5 straight weeks, while Bitcoin and Ethereum ETF products were seeing net outflows over that same stretch. That's a genuinely unusual divergence, the kind of thing that gets analysts calling XRP the relative strength trade among listed crypto products, at least for that specific window. And there's a really specific, almost granular signal worth mentioning too. In June specifically, retail size wallets, the ones holding under 10,000 XRP, have actually been showing increased inflows onto exchanges, meaning smaller holders look like they're taking profits or reducing exposure right at the same time the whale cohort keeps accumulating. That divergence, retail trimming while whales keep buying, is a pattern that shown up before XRP made bigger moves historically. I want to be careful with that phrase, historically preceded, because it's describing a pattern, not promising a repeat performance. But it's a real documented divergence happening in the data right now, not a vague vibe. Now, I think it would be dishonest of me to just stack up the bullish sounding stats from the past couple weeks and call it a day, because the actual story across this whole year has been way messier and more interesting than a clean one direction accumulation narrative. And I think understanding the messiness is actually more useful than pretending whales have been smoothly buying nonstop since January. Back in February, there was a very different looking signal. Roughly 3.8 billion XRP flowed from whale wallets into Binance since the start of that year. A steady, deliberate climb in deposits, the kind of pattern that, on its own, usually gets read as potential sell-side positioning, not accumulation. At the exact same time, though, the overall exchange supply ratio on Binance was actually declining, meaning a different group, possibly long-term retail holders, possibly a different whale cohort, was simultaneously pulling coins out even as other large wallets were depositing in. So you had two opposing flows happening simultaneously, which is exactly the kind of confusing picture that a single headline statistic in either direction completely fails to capture. One analyst covering the data at the time pointed out that heavy whale inflows to exchanges have historically coincided with short-term corrections or strategic repositioning ahead of a new trend forming, which is a fairly neutral way of saying this kind of flow can mean almost anything depending on what happens next. And trying to read it in real time in the moment is genuinely difficult, even for people who do this professionally. Then in March, things got genuinely rough. XRP had dropped to around $1.37, down 62% from its all-time high of $3.65 set back in July of last year. According to Glassnode data, something like 60% of circulating XRP supply was sitting at a loss relative to where holders had bought in, meaning the majority of holders were underwater and represented potential sell pressure every time the price rallied back toward their break-even point. XRPL payment volumes had collapsed 90% from their February peak, which raised a completely legitimate question at the time. What's actually driving demand here beyond speculation and whale positioning if the network's own payment activity is falling off a cliff? On top of that, XRP ETFs recorded net outflows for 3 consecutive trading days right around that same stretch. $18 million worth on a single day alone, which is the kind of detail that gets lost if you only look at the much rosier, more recent ETF inflow streak, without acknowledging that the picture flipped entirely just a few months earlier. And yet, in that exact rough stretch, whale wallets added 1.3 billion XRP in just 48 hours in early March, and $738 million worth of XRP flowed off exchanges in a single day on March 10th, one of the largest cold storage moves of the entire year. Wallets specifically in the 100 million to 1 billion XRP range added that 1.3 billion as a group, and in the days following, an additional 140 million XRP got added by the single largest wallet tier specifically. So you had whales buying aggressively into a moment when the broader holder base was sitting on losses and the network's own payment volume had collapsed. That's either a sign of real conviction about a longer time horizon than retail typically operates on, or it's a sign that whale behavior and genuine fundamental strength don't always move together. And honestly, probably some of both. I think laying out that messier full-year picture actually makes the most recent activity more credible, not less, because it shows whale accumulation hasn't been one smooth, uninterrupted story used to justify whatever the current price happens to be doing. It's had real reversals, real moments of conflicting signals, and at least one stretch back in March where aggressive whale buying coincided with the majority of the broader holder base sitting on losses and the network's own payment volume collapsing. So given all that texture, what's the actual case for why whales might be doing what they're doing right now beyond just pure speculative price? Speculation. A few real concrete things have been developing. RLUSD, Ripple's own dollar-backed stablecoin, launched back in December the year before, has grown to a market cap north of $1.5 billion. And it's reportedly capturing something like 20-30% of Ripple's overall transaction volume at this point. Some analysts have flagged that as a dilution risk for XRP, specifically if RLUSD keeps eating into the volume that used to flow through XRP directly. But on-chain data still shows XRP accounting for roughly 70% of flows through Ripple's payment corridors. Despite RLUSD's growth, meaning XRP hasn't been displaced as the primary bridge asset yet, even with the competing product from the same company gaining ground. There's also been real movement on the tokenization side. Several firms have been tokenizing actual treasury bills and corporate bonds directly on the XRP ledger, taking advantage of its low fees and fast settlement times. That's the kind of activity that creates organic, structural demand for using the network separate from anyone's price prediction, real-world assets actually settling on real infrastructure. There's also been progress on a more specialized front, an ASIC-style approval for a tokenized Australian dollar product, AUDD, on the XRP ledger, which signals regulators in at least one additional jurisdiction are comfortable enough with the network's compliance posture to greenlight a real, regulated stablecoin built on top of it. And there's the regulatory and ETF angle too. The SEC's long-running case against Ripple reached resolution back in 2024 into 2025, removing what had been the single biggest legal overhang on XRP for years. That cleared the path for 7 spot XRP ETFs to actually launch and start trading as of earlier this year. There were still additional XRP ETF applications pending SEC review, with decisions expected around the middle of this year, and approval of even more products could plausibly bring in an estimated $5 to $10 billion in fresh institutional inflows if it happens, though obviously that's a forward-looking scenario, not a locked-in outcome. There's also been engagement on the central bank side, with Ripple's CBDC platform reportedly holding active conversations with monetary authorities in at least 6 different countries, each new integration theoretically raising the baseline. Demand for XRP, specifically in its role as a bridge currency between different national digital currency systems. On top of all that, there's been actual technical development work too. The XRP ledger pushed out version 3, 2.0 on June 15th, lowering server resource consumption by up to 40%, with a stated roadmap that includes enhanced privacy features, DeFi lending functionality, and improved programmability. That's infrastructure maturation. The unglamorous kind of progress that doesn't make for an exciting headline, but matters for whether the network can actually support more sophisticated financial products being built on top of it over. Now, here's the genuinely important caveat, the one I think gets skipped over constantly in whales or accumulating content. One detailed flow analysis specifically flagged that XRP whale accumulation might be utility-driven rather than purely speculative, meaning some of this buying could be tied to actual settlement and stablecoin operational needs. Institutions acquiring XRP because they needed to function as a bridge asset for real payment activity. Not because they're making a directional bet that the price is about to explode. If that's true, even partially, it changes how you should read whales are buying as a signal. Operational accumulation for settlement purposes doesn't necessarily translate into the kind of sustained, speculative-driven price pressure that pure investment accumulation would, because the buyer's actual goal isn't price appreciation. It's having enough XRP on hand to keep payment corridors functioning. That same analysis suggested two specific things worth watching to tell the difference between the two scenarios going forward. First, whether exchange reserves keep declining in a sustained way, since tokens genuinely leaving the liquid trading environment for good, supports the idea that this is real long-term accumulation rather than short-term repositioning. Second, whether spot trading volume actually picks up enough to absorb large orders, without just sitting quietly in what one analyst called a boring accumulation phase, since a transition into more active, visible market participation would suggest the accumulation is starting to translate into something the broader market actually notices and reacts to, rather than staying a background phenomenon that only shows up if you're specifically looking at wallet level data. There's also the open question of which whales we're even talking about, because whale isn't one single entity with one single motive. Some of that 1 million plus cohort is genuinely independent. Long-term retail turned whale accumulation built up slowly by individuals over years. Some of it is exchange treasury management, pooled customer funds growing simply because more retail users are depositing. Some of it is institutional players building strategic positions, the kind of corporate XRP treasuries that have started appearing on the radar over the past couple years. And some of it plausibly is exactly the operational settlement-driven accumulation the flow analysis flagged. Lumping all of that into one single whales are buying headline flattens out a genuinely more complicated, more interesting reality where different categories of large holder are doing fundamentally different things for fundamentally different reasons that all happen to look identical from the outside if you only ever check one chart. I think the more useful mental model, if you actually want to track this kind of thing going forward yourself, is to stop asking are whales buying or selling as a single yes or no question and start asking a few more specific ones instead. Is the accumulation happening alongside declining payment volume, the way it did in March, which would suggest it's more speculative than utility-driven? Or is it happening alongside rising network activity and real tokenization volume, the way some of the more recent data suggests wallets which would point more toward genuine operational demand? Is the exchange outflow broad-based across many different wallets, sizes, or concentrated in just one or two specific cohorts, since a narrow concentrated move tells a different story than a genuinely broad one? And is the ETF flow data confirming the on-chain picture or contradicting it, the way it did during that 3-day outflow stretch in March, even while some whale wallets were still adding to their positions? Asking those more specific questions won't give you a certain answer either. Nothing will. But it gets you a lot closer to an honest read than collapsing an entire year of genuinely contradictory signals into one tidy, exciting headline number. And I think it's worth ending on this point specifically because it's the thing I'd actually want someone to remember after watching this more than any single statistic. A percentage describing how much supply whales control tells you almost nothing on its own about what happens to the price. Next, it tells you about concentration, not about direction. Direction comes from watching the actual flows, the actual divergences between different holder groups, and the actual context surrounding why those flows are happening. Settlement infrastructure being built out, ETF decisions pending, regulatory clarity finally arriving after years of legal uncertainty, all of it layered together rather than any single piece standing alone as the explanation. The whales controlling a large share of supply has been true for years now, through rallies and through 60% drawdowns alike. What's actually changed period to period isn't the concentration, it's the behavior layered on top of it. And that behavior is the only part of the story actually worth tracking closely, rather than the static percentage that barely moves no matter what the price is doing. If walking through the actual texture behind these whale flows, instead of just repeating the cleanest, most exciting version of the story is useful to you, go ahead and hit like on this one. It genuinely helps put this kind of honest, fuller picture in front of more people, instead of the version that flattens out a whole year of conflicting signals into one tidy headline number. Subscribe if you want more of this, the actual on-chain texture tracked properly across the full timeline, instead of cherry-pick snapshots dressed up as the whole story. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, after seeing the full year's worth of whale activity instead of just the last 2 weeks. Does the current accumulation signal actually change your read on XRP, or does knowing how mixed this picture has been all year make you more cautious about reading too much into any single data point? And if you know somebody who's been sharing the whales control 80%, and they're all buying version of this story without ever looking at how messy and reversal prone that same data has actually been across the year, send them this video. Have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others. It really helps the channel grow. This is XRP Hobart signing off. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next one.